You think you can just treat us like this? Willie Johnson's voice cracked through the heavy air as his hands trembled in frustration. The tension in the parking lot was palpable, with the bright neon lights of the supermarket casting long shadows on the asphalt. His wife, Mary, stood beside him, her once proud posture now sagging under the weight of the humiliation. They had come to pick up a few groceries, nothing special, just another routine day in their quiet life. But that had all changed when the officers approached. "We're not doing anything wrong," Willie continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The two officers, one tall and burly, the other shorter but just as imposing, exchanged a glance before narrowing their eyes at him. "That's what they all say," the taller officer muttered, his hand resting on his holstered gun, clearly not caring about the truth. Mary tried to keep her composure, clutching the shopping bags in her hands as if they could shield her from the injustice unfolding before them. The officers had stopped them out of nowhere, claiming they fit the description of two thieves who had been reported stealing from the store. Mary, who had been a faithful customer here for years, knew the only thing she was guilty of was being black. "Let's see what you've got in those bags," the shorter officer demanded, his voice cold. "We don't need to open them," Mary replied softly, trying to stay calm, but the words caught in her throat. She knew the drill. The suspicion, the eyes that followed her every movement, the way her very existence was questioned. "Open them now," the officer repeated, his tone rising. Willie stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he did his best to remain composed. He had fought for his country, served in the army, and survived countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for this, being accused of theft by the very people sworn to serve and protect. Just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control, the sound of an engine revving broke through the tense atmosphere. A car rolled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The officers turned, momentarily distracted by the arrival. It wasn't just any car, it was a sleek black SUV with military plates. The door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his presence commanding. James Johnson, Willie's son, had returned home from his latest deployment in the Marines. He had been overseas for months, but the moment he received the call from his mother about the trouble they were facing, he knew he had to come home. His jaw clenched as he saw the scene before him, his parents, treated like criminals in a parking lot. Without a word, James strode over to the officers, his military boots thudding loudly against the pavement. He was the epitome of confidence and authority, a stark contrast to the vulnerable couple standing in front of him. "What's going on here?" James demanded, his voice firm but not raised. The officers, stunned by his appearance, hesitated. "These two were being difficult, resisting our authority," the taller officer explained, his voice shaking just slightly. James didn't take his eyes off the officer as he stepped closer, his presence alone enough to make the officers uneasy. "You've got a problem with my parents?" he asked, his voice low and cold. The officers shifted, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "I said, what's going on?" James repeated, his tone growing more commanding. The taller officer cleared his throat and looked away, uncomfortable under James' gaze. The shorter officer, who had been the one to harass Willie and Mary, shifted his weight uneasily. The change in power was instant and undeniable. In a moment, the officers realized they had overstepped their bounds. They had wrongly assumed that this elderly couple was beneath them, but the presence of someone like James, someone who commanded respect and knew how to use his authority, was enough to make them question their actions. Without another word, the officers backed off, muttering apologies under their breath. Willie stood taller now, his hands still shaking but his pride restored. Mary's eyes filled with tears of relief as she wrapped her arms around her husband. James didn't need to say more. His mere presence had shifted the balance of power, showing the officers that they couldn't just walk all over his parents. They would never be disrespected again. The moment had been brief, but it was enough to remind everyone present of one thing: respect, honor, and justice were not to be taken lightly. The parking lot fell into a strange, uncomfortable silence as James stood facing the officers. The tension between them was thick, like a wall that no one was willing to break. James didn't back down. He knew his parents, Willie and Mary, had been humiliated enough. He had seen the look in his mother's eyes, a look of helplessness that tore at his heart. He wasn't about to let this go, not with the injustice hanging so thick in the air. As the officers took a step back, muttering their apologies under their breath, James stood tall, his stance firm, letting them know that their actions would not go unchallenged. The officers didn't apologize directly to Willie and Mary, but their discomfort was clear. They had misjudged the situation, and the realization hit them hard. James felt his father's hand on his shoulder, the weight of the old man's gratitude grounding him. "You always know how to handle things, son," Willie said quietly, his voice shaky with emotion. James looked at him, his expression softening. "I couldn't let them do that to you," he replied. Mary, still holding her shopping bags, wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. She gave James a small, thankful smile, but the weight of the encounter still lingered. As they made their way back to the car, James noticed how different things felt. The air was no longer filled with the sharp sting of injustice. It was quieter now, but the unspoken words between them said it all. They were family, and they would always have each other's backs. James opened the car door for his parents, then slid into the driver's seat. The engine hummed to life, and he pulled out of the parking lot, heading down the familiar streets that led home. He could feel the weight of what had happened settling in his chest. He wasn't just angry at the officers for what they had done. He was angry at the world for still allowing this kind of treatment to happen. As they drove through the city, the lights reflecting off the windows, James's mind raced. What kind of world was it where people like his parents, hardworking and good-hearted, were treated like criminals because of the color of their skin? He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Mary and Willie sitting quietly in the back seat, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. He wanted to make it all better for them, to somehow erase the sting of what had happened, but he knew it wasn't that simple. No matter how many times he came back home, no matter how many times he tried to fight these battles, the world wasn't going to change overnight. The reality of the situation sat heavy in his heart. But as they drove on, James couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. His parents had raised him to believe in doing what was right, no matter the cost. And in that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for them when no one else would, and that mattered. He just hoped that someday, things would be different for them, for everyone who had been treated the same way. But for now, he was content knowing that, at least for today, his parents had someone who would always stand by them. As James drove through the familiar streets, the weight of the day began to settle in. His parents, sitting quietly in the back seat, were finally starting to relax, but James could see the lingering tension in their faces. They had been through so much in their lives, and today had only added to the emotional toll. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through the events that had unfolded earlier. He had always been taught to stand up for what was right, to protect his family no matter the cost. But today, something had shifted. The anger he had felt toward the officers still simmered beneath the surface. But it wasn't just the injustice that bothered him. It was the realization that his parents, who had worked hard their entire lives, were still being treated like second-class citizens because of the color of their skin. He clenched the steering wheel tighter, trying to push the thoughts away. He didn't want to think about it anymore. He just wanted to get home. As they turned onto their street, James could feel the familiar comfort of home waiting for them, a place where they could finally feel safe. He pulled into the driveway, the headlights casting a long shadow across the lawn. The house was quiet, peaceful even, in stark contrast to the chaos of the day. James cut the engine and turned to look at his parents. His mother, Mary, was the first to speak. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Willie, his father, gave a small nod in agreement. "You've always been there for us, son. We're proud of you." James felt his chest tighten. He wasn't looking for praise, but hearing his parents say those words meant more than anything else in the world. "I just did what I had to do," he said quietly. "No one should ever treat you like that. Not on my watch." He glanced at his parents, their eyes filled with both pride and relief. It was in moments like these that James realized how much he had been shaped by his upbringing. His parents had always taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it meant facing down injustice. But today, he had seen firsthand just how deep the roots of racism went, how it affected even the most ordinary moments of life. The world was supposed to be better than this, but it wasn't. At least not yet. James opened the door and stepped out of the car, stretching his legs. He needed to clear his head. "Come inside," Mary said, motioning for him to follow her. "Let's get you something to eat. You've had a long day." James followed them into the house, the warm smell of dinner already wafting from the kitchen. He wasn't hungry, but he didn't want to be alone in his thoughts either. As they sat down at the table, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. What had happened at the grocery store, how Willie had managed to fix the leaky faucet earlier that day. It was the same easygoing chatter they always shared at the dinner table, but for James, it felt different now. He kept glancing at his parents, their faces more relaxed, but still, there was something there, something that wouldn't go away just because they were home. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the fight for justice was far from over. And yet, in the quiet of their home, he found a small sense of peace. The world outside may have been full of hate and division, but in here, in this space, there was love, and for now, that was enough. The next few days were quieter, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he needed to do, more he could do for his parents, and for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. He kept replaying the scene in the parking lot, how his parents had stood there, helpless, while the officers belittled them. His stomach churned just thinking about it. He knew that what had happened to his family was not an isolated incident, it was part of a much bigger problem. The realization hit him hard. He had spent his life trying to protect his loved ones, but what about everyone else who didn't have someone like him around when they needed help? The thought kept him up late into the night, his mind racing with ideas. The next morning, James decided to take action. He knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he could start with something small, something that might make a difference for people like his parents. He contacted a local community center that worked with families who had been affected by racial injustice. He didn't know exactly what he could offer, but he knew he had to try. He wanted to give back, to be a voice for those who felt powerless, just like his parents had. He spent the next few days meeting with the center's director, talking about ways to support families facing discrimination, whether it was through legal aid, advocacy, or simply providing a safe space for them to be heard. It was exhausting work, but it felt right. Slowly, James began to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't matter. Meanwhile, back at home, Mary and Willie were starting to heal. They had never been ones to dwell on their troubles, but the emotional scars from the incident were hard to ignore. Mary found solace in the little things, sitting on the porch in the morning sun, reading a book, or simply spending time with Willie. He, too, was finding ways to cope. He had always been a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands. So, he started fixing things around the house, leaky faucets, broken windows, anything that needed attention. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of control. Something he hadn't felt in days. They both knew that what had happened in the parking lot couldn't be erased, but they were determined not to let it define them. The sense of injustice still lingered, but it no longer consumed them. It was a small victory, but it was enough. One evening, as James sat at the kitchen table with his parents, they shared a quiet dinner together. The room was warm, filled with the familiar sounds of their conversation, the clinking of silverware, the laughter from a shared joke, the simple comfort of family. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a while, it felt like they were moving forward. James looked at his parents, his heart full of gratitude. They had taught him everything he needed to know about resilience, about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: he would never stop fighting for the people he loved, and for everyone who needed a voice. James stood by the window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the houses and trees, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But in his mind, the work was far from over. The meetings at the community center were starting to pay off, but he felt like he was only scratching the surface. He wanted to do more, to push harder, to make a real difference. The anger from the day in the parking lot had fueled him, but now it was a quiet, persistent drive to change things for good. He glanced over at his parents, sitting at the kitchen table, their faces soft with a mixture of gratitude and concern. They had always been proud of him, but today, they seemed to notice a change in him, a deeper sense of purpose. "You've been working hard lately," Mary said, her voice gentle but full of concern. "Are you taking care of yourself, James?" He turned to face her, offering a small smile. "I'm fine, Mom," he said. "Just trying to make sure no one else goes through what you two did." Willie nodded in agreement, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "We're proud of you, son. But remember, it's okay to take a break. You've got a lot on your shoulders." James sat down beside them, feeling a wave of emotion hit him. His parents had always been the rock in his life, the ones who taught him to persevere, no matter what. Now, as they sat there, showing concern for him, it reminded him of just how far they had come together. The world may be full of challenges, but in this room, with these people, he found strength. "I know, Dad. I need to do something. I can't let this go. I know there's so much more to be done," James said, his voice soft but resolute. Mary placed her hand on his, offering him a comforting squeeze. "You're doing what you can. But don't forget to take care of yourself along the way. We need you strong, too." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had always been focused on protecting others, but in his quest for justice, he sometimes forgot that he needed to protect himself as well. The next morning, James woke early, as he had become accustomed to, and grabbed his phone to check the latest news on racial justice initiatives. His inbox was flooded with messages about protests, petitions, and support networks, people, organizations, and allies all working toward the same goal. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but the momentum was growing. It felt like the world was finally starting to listen. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He wanted to push further. He had been thinking a lot about his future, about how he could continue to fight for equality while balancing his family life and his own well-being. He had always wanted to make a difference, but now, more than ever, he realized that the fight wasn't just about one victory. It was about continuing the work for generations to come. After a long day at the community center, where he had met with other advocates and shared ideas, James returned home to find Willie working on the garden outside. It was a simple task, planting flowers in the backyard, but it was one that gave Willie a sense of purpose. James sat down beside him, watching as his father carefully placed each plant in the soil. "How's it going?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Slowly but surely," Willie replied, a grin spreading across his face. "There's something about working with my hands that helps me clear my mind." James smiled, his gaze falling on the flowers in the garden. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him that even in the midst of the struggle, there were moments of peace. He realized that, no matter how hard he worked, he had to remember to appreciate the small things. It was those moments, sitting with his parents, enjoying a quiet evening at home, that reminded him of what he was fighting for. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for a future where moments like this were possible for everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The fight was far from over, but James was beginning to see that change was already happening, one small step at a time. James woke up to a fresh, quiet morning. The sun streamed in through the kitchen window, casting long shadows over the table. He stood at the counter, pouring a cup of coffee, feeling the warmth in his hands as he thought about the path ahead. The last few weeks had been a blur: meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. But amidst all the chaos, there was something that kept him grounded: his family. He looked over at his parents, who were sitting at the table, enjoying a peaceful breakfast together. Despite the weight of everything going on in the world, these moments of normalcy were what kept him going. He set the coffee cup down in front of his mother, Mary, who gave him a small, tired smile. "Thanks, James," she said softly, her voice calm. "You've been working hard lately. Don't forget to take care of yourself, too." James sat down across from her, his hands wrapped around his own mug. He hadn't realized just how much he'd been pushing himself until she said that. He had been so focused on the fight for justice, on making sure his parents never had to face something like that again, that he had forgotten to slow down. He didn't want to admit it, but the exhaustion was starting to take a toll on him. "I'm fine, Mom," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Just a lot on my plate right now." Willie, his father, chuckled softly from the other side of the table. "We know, son. You're always trying to fix everything for everyone else. But don't forget, even the strongest trees need rest." James smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for his father's wisdom. It was moments like these that reminded him of the lessons he'd learned growing up. His parents had always taught him the importance of balance, working hard for what was right, but also knowing when to step back and take care of himself. As they ate, James's mind drifted back to the community center and the work he had been doing. He had met with several local leaders, discussing ways to implement real change in the community. It wasn't easy work, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but he could see the seeds of something powerful starting to take root. People were beginning to listen. He knew it was just the beginning, but it felt like something was shifting in the air. He felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. As the day went on, James spent a few hours at the center, coordinating with the other volunteers and activists. They were working on a project that would provide legal aid to families who had been wronged by the system, a step toward ensuring that those who had been mistreated had the resources they needed to fight back. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Later that afternoon, James received a call from one of the local reporters who had been following the story. "James, we've been getting some traction," the reporter said. "People are starting to talk about what happened in the parking lot, and they're asking for change. Your voice is being heard." James felt a rush of emotions: relief, pride, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The work was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was making a real difference. As he hung up the phone, he looked out the window of the center, seeing families walking by, children playing in the park. It was a beautiful day, and for a moment, it was easy to forget about the battles ahead. But then he reminded himself that it was the people in this community, the ones who fought every day, who kept him going. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for all of them. And that was something worth waking up for. James sat in his car outside the community center, the engine still running, but he didn't move. His mind was running as fast as the thoughts were bouncing through his head. The past few weeks had felt like a blur. Things were changing, slowly but surely, and he could feel it in his bones. But there was more to be done. He had worked so hard to make sure his parents never had to face what they did that day again. But as the days passed, he realized that what had happened to them was not unique. It was a reflection of the world around them, of the systemic issues that ran deeper than one encounter in a parking lot. And it weighed on him. It wasn't just about changing his community or his city anymore. It was about a larger fight. He had been fighting for his parents, for his family, but now he was fighting for everyone who had been affected by injustice. The world needed to change, and he needed to be part of that change. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way inside. The center was bustling with activity. Volunteers were setting up tables, discussing plans, organizing resources for the next project. James greeted a few people, his mind still racing. But as he walked through the halls, he began to feel a sense of calm. This was where he belonged. This was where he could make a difference. He was starting to feel the momentum building, not just in the center, but in the community itself. People were starting to come together in ways he hadn't expected. He had always believed that change would come from the ground up, and now, more than ever, he was seeing that belief come to life. The work was hard, but it was worth it. That night, after a long day of meetings and organizing, James returned home, exhausted but hopeful. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He made his way to the living room, where Willie and Mary were sitting together, watching a news report. James sank into the chair beside them, letting out a sigh as he rubbed his eyes. "How's everything going?" Mary asked, glancing up at him. "It's moving," James said, his voice tired but filled with a quiet sense of pride. "It's slow, but we're getting there." Willie nodded, a small smile on his face. "That's all you can do, son. Keep pushing. Change doesn't happen overnight." James smiled back, feeling the weight of his father's words. He had heard them 1,000 times before, but tonight, they hit differently. He had always known his parents had been through so much in their lives, but now he understood the depth of their resilience. They had taught him to never stop pushing, to never stop fighting for what was right. And it was because of them that he was where he was today. As he sat there with them, the quiet in the room felt different now. It was peaceful, yes, but it was also full of potential. They had been through so much, but they had never given up. And that strength, that unwavering determination, was what would drive them all forward. James looked at his parents, a sense of peace washing over him. He wasn't sure where this fight would take him, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't in it alone. And together they would keep fighting, for themselves, for their community, and for the future they all wanted to build. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of progress. James felt the momentum building in his community, the energy growing with every conversation, every meeting. People were starting to show up in numbers he hadn't expected, ready to take action, ready to make a difference. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be solved overnight, but it was something people could get behind. As he worked on various initiatives, legal aid projects, community outreach, and raising awareness, he began to see a shift. The conversations were changing. It wasn't just about talking anymore, it was about acting. And that action was spreading, creating a ripple effect that reached even the most unlikely corners of the city. James had been so focused on making sure his parents never had to face what they did in that parking lot again, but now, he realized the importance of expanding that fight. It wasn't just about one injustice. It was about making sure that no one else ever had to feel what they had felt. One night, as James sat in the office of the community center, reviewing paperwork for an upcoming event, his phone buzzed. On the desk. He looked down, seeing a message from the local news station. "We want to do a segment on the work you've been doing in the community. Would you be willing to speak on air?" At first, James hesitated. He had always been a private person, never one for the spotlight. But then he thought about his parents, about what they had gone through, about how far they had come. This wasn't about him. It was about the people who had been ignored, about the voices that had been silenced for too long. He made the decision then and there. He was going to do it. The next morning, he stood in front of the camera at the local news station, the bright lights shining down on him as the reporter asked him questions. He wasn't used to speaking in front of a camera, but the words came easily. He talked about his parents, about the injustice they faced, about the fight for equality. But he didn't stop there. He talked about the work being done in the community, about the people who were coming together to make real change. "This isn't just about one person," he said, his voice steady but full of passion. "This is about all of us. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with dignity and respect." As the interview ended and the cameras shut off, James felt a strange sense of relief. He hadn't expected to feel this way. But as he walked out of the station, he realized something important. This wasn't just a moment for him. It was a moment for everyone. It was a step forward in a fight that was far from over, but it was a step in the right direction. The following days were a whirlwind. James continued to work on the initiatives he had started, but now, there was more attention on his efforts. People were reaching out, asking how they could help, how they could be a part of the change. And slowly, the work he had been doing started to have a bigger impact. It wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about all the families who had been affected by the same issues. James knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling, but he also knew that they were making progress. He looked around at the people in the community who were working alongside him, his parents, his friends, the volunteers, and he felt a sense of pride he had never felt before. They were doing this together. And together, they would keep fighting for what was right. Months passed, and the momentum James had sparked in his community began to snowball. What had once been a small group of volunteers now grew into a full-fledged movement, one that reached far beyond the city's borders. People were showing up, eager to be a part of the change, to stand up for justice in a way that had never been done before. James could feel the difference in the air. The conversations had shifted. It wasn't just about the pain anymore. It was about the collective strength that came from fighting together. He spent every day working side by side with the people who had supported him from the beginning, his parents, his friends, the local volunteers, and he could see the transformation happening before his eyes. They weren't just changing policies anymore. They were changing hearts and minds. One afternoon, as James was walking through the community center, he stopped to talk to a young woman who had recently started volunteering. "I've been following the news about what you've been doing," she said, her voice full of admiration. "You've inspired so many of us to get involved. I never thought my voice would matter, but now I see it does." Her words hit James harder than he expected. He had always been focused on the work, the meetings, the events, the initiatives, but he hadn't realized just how much impact his efforts had on the people around him. The work he had started with his family had turned into something much larger, and he was beginning to see the ripples of that change spread through the community. As the day went on, James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about the recognition anymore. It was about knowing that his efforts had made a real difference. The people he was working with weren't just helping him, they were helping each other, and together, they were building something stronger than he had ever imagined. That night, as James sat at home with his parents, the three of them shared a quiet dinner together. The house was peaceful, a contrast to the whirlwind of the past few months. It had been a long journey, and while there was still much work to be done, James finally felt like they were on the right path. "You've come a long way, son," Willie said, his voice full of pride as he looked across the table at James. "We always knew you'd do something special, but we never expected this." James looked at his father, the words hitting him deep in his chest. He had always wanted to make them proud, but now, for the first time, he realized how much they had shaped him. It wasn't just his own fight anymore. It was the fight for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, forgotten, or silenced. "We did it together," James said, his voice full of gratitude. "This has always been about us. About all of us." As the evening drew to a close, James stepped outside onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against his face. He stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. The work they were doing was making a difference, and that was all that mattered. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and his purpose. And with that, James knew that together, they could keep fighting for what was right.